Okay, everyone, thank you for coming and welcome. You're joining us today for a discussion of Selma, directed by Ava Duvernay. I'm Rachel Taylor, Adult Services Librarian at the Scranton Memorial Library in Madison, Connecticut, and we are joined today by Siobhan Carter-David, Professor of History, Gender Studies, and Media Studies at Southern Connecticut University, and she will be facilitating our discussion. So thank you so much for being here.
Yes. So thank you again for having me. And I think I started off saying earlier that the most important thing to me about teaching U.S. history is trying to get my students to think about how everyone contributes to the story of what it means to be this country, and to sort of make sure we're giving a fully fleshed out version of that history. So with that in mind, all of my sort of questions that I have prepared are really about having us take a look inward about what's going on today. And so my first thought was actually a meme I saw on social media today. And it said, if you want to know what you would have been doing during slavery, what you would have been doing during the Holocaust, or what you would have been doing during the Civil Rights Movement, you're doing it right now. And so with that in mind, I was wondering if anyone saw themselves in the movie. I thought that was a good way to sort of open up.
If anyone saw what?
Saw themselves in the movie in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not literally saw yourself there, but maybe somewhere behind the scenes or...
When I see a movie like that, I always see myself in some part of the movie.
Right.
And you always, from an African-American male point of view, you look at yourself from the struggle and the challenges you face every day. Even in today's society, you still struggle with a lot of the things that you saw in 1965 when I was like maybe 18 as a teenager. And today, being 70 plus, you still face those same challenges. And particularly when you are confronted with power, and power affects your life, even as you progress from a teenager to a young adult or to a man. You know, you still have the same concerns. And as luck would have it, I had the opportunity just yesterday to see Just Mercy, which is really parallel to a lot of the things that we're seeing today in our society as far as justice is being upheld and how justice is being prevailed. And you look at it in the context that it's still in Alabama. All of that whole story today is still in Montgomery, Alabama. Which just upsets you so much to think that that still happens in our country today in 2020.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's
Racism is still alive in this country, and it's doing very, very well, unfortunately. But the step before racism is slavery. We had slaves living here in this town, by the way, in Madison, Guilford, Massachusetts, up at the airport. We had slaves all around this place here. And this country would not be what it is if we didn't have slaves. It was the money produced, and the more slaves you had, the more money you made. And our forefathers, they had slaves, and not just one, and they had relationships with them. They had kids with them.
Built the country.
Yeah, they built the country. And you don't hear much about that, though. And you know, I think 340 years. And you wonder, they had very, very smart people. Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They were smart people. But they had slaves. And somehow my brain says, how could they do this? How could they do this? Beyond my understanding. And yet, I've looked at books and everything else. You don't see much about it in the education. When I was growing up, we had one black kid in my high school. We had 640 kids graduate. One black kid. Never heard the word the N-word in my family. But they were racist. I brought a friend home, and after he left, they all said, "What are you doing? What happened? What'd you bring him in the house for?" I said, "Why not?" But they never used that word, but they were racist in a very, very mild sense. And then I was going to have one of my best friends at my wedding. I was in the military, kind of busy. And the family got together, and they says, "No, you can't have your best friend." As my mother said to me, who would look at the pictures and what would they think? And it just didn't dawn on me. I said, what do you mean, what would they think? What do you care what they think? They overruled me, and I had to tell my best friend, "You're my best friend, like you can't be in the wedding, though." He said, "I understand that, Mike." And we were still friends for 50 years, by the way. But I mean, My son lives down in North Carolina. We raised him. He spent 20 some odd years up here in Connecticut. And when he went down to North Carolina, he became very successful, making tons of money. And I was going to bring up something about police officers. White police officers, they kill a lot of black people. Nothing happens to them. They get their hands slapped. And I was going to bring it up, and his wife said, please don't bring it up. And I didn't, of course. But he watches no TV, reads no newspapers. He has nothing, except he makes money, lots of money. Owns 3 handguns. I said, what do you own 3 handguns for? Protection, Dad. What's wrong with you? Don't you know this is a tough society? Oh, sure, it is a tough society, and it's a dangerous society. But lots of people killed by handguns in this country. Lots of different kinds of people. Our prison system, we have more black people in prisons than in any country in the world. More than China, more than Russia. And nobody really seems to be too much concerned about that. Now we're building private prisons, and they're making tons of money because only they can supervise it. And once you go into that prison, you're gone. I mean, they have no rules there that you can find out what's going on in there. Yeah. Our society has taken some really, really bad changes in the last 20 years. At one time in this society, you could get a job the next day. If you quit one job, you get it the next day. Today, you can't do that. It's very, very difficult. Educational system, don't hear much about it. It's just scary. Pulpits, ministers, don't hear much about it. No matter which church you go to, you hear a little bit. But, you know, if you don't put money in the basket, you're not going to have the church. And some people that they used to come to this church right here. They didn't like what was going on. It had nothing to do with racism, but they left, and their money went with them. So it's a tough thing. It's not easy to figure out what's going on. But slavery, you know, I was reading a book by Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, old book, played basketball, very successful. He lived up in the Bronx and different places there. Mom and dad, hard workers. He went to Catholic schools for all his life until he became a pro basketball player. And then he started reading about other religious educations. And he found that, hey, I want to be like these other people, not like these Christians. He didn't find much education in the Christian education. And they used the N-word. His coach used the N-word describing him one time. And he said, I thought he was a great coach. He is a great coach, but I never heard anybody use that word in a professional sense, he said. And he used it to motivate me to have a better game. And I did. He did motivate me. But he said, my respect for him went out the window, he said. So we have a long, long way to go, it seems. And it seems that we're going backward instead of forward.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that, because some of the questions I want us to engage have to do with how much things have changed and how much they remain the same. And I want to start off with a really sad but really poignant part of the film, which is the very beginning. So we start off the film seeing the 4 little girls, and then talking about they're walking down the steps, they're going down to the basement because we know that that's where they were when the bomb hit. They were heading downstairs, and they're talking about Coretta Scott King's hair, and they're talking about, oh, I know how she did this, and my mom won't let me do my hair like this, and I did my hair, and I went in the pool, and all these things are happening, and they're talking about this, and then we see the explosion. But let's just forget about the explosion for a minute and go back to those 4 girls having that conversation. And what I wanted us to think about was, considering Michelle Obama's role as former First Lady, in what way does representation matter here? I'm just thinking about that. Forget about Barack Obama's policies. I'm just thinking about the symbol of Michelle Obama and what she represents to Black women and girls, and just sort of thinking about Coretta Scott King representing that to these little girls. And so I'm just curious about that point. It's a small point, but then we see her continuously emerge throughout the film as this important person throughout.
Someone who has power, okay, and someone who is well respected and really has an impeccable history of, you know, success, but having come from somewhat humble beginnings. But I think a lot of people can relate to her just in what she's done in her life, and so I think, you know, to start with that.
Mm-hmm.
I look at her in the context of a role model,
Right.
in the sense of accomplishments. and you look at an individual who started off with a modest life and who excelled to that level, and you see a lot of young people emulating her and the things that she did, particularly in light of education, and you look at the foundation that she started out in Chicago, you look at the work that she's did in Chicago, far as in Princeton, far as the number of groups that she's formed out there, far as students go. You look at the book readings and things like that, I think are very positive. She always tells the story, even when she was First Lady in the White House, and she would be walking through the White House, and you would have tourists, and particularly African American female tourists. They always looked at her as still, quote, their sister. And they would say things like, "Hey girl," and she could always say, "I knew it was an African American sister calling me." Even being First Lady, they still saying, "Hey girl." You know, in that context, and that means a lot because they have a feeling that she's still part of them, and she comes out of their mold, and they can relate, and I think that's real positive.
I think of her as a symbol of beauty. I remember that photograph of the little girl looking at her portrait, the portrait of Michelle Obama in the White House, and that kind of adoration and recognition in that little girl's face. She's just a beautiful person inside and out, and you know, I can't imagine anybody who wouldn't think that. She's just amazing.
I think she shows all of us, regardless of what race you are, how to wear confidence with class. She really does. Just kind of anything that you see her do, she always seems to just be comfortable in her skin. It's good for all of us.
It's not uncommon to hear people say today, you know, be your best Michelle, be Michelle today. Oh, wow. I've heard that said, yeah. This is a call to black women to say.
Yeah, well, that's good.
Bring your Michelle game.
Yeah.
So one thing I was thinking about too was, so one thing that I talk a lot about in my U.S. history class is that by the time we get to the movements of the 1960s, we begin to use television as a way to publicize our activism. And so people say that Vietnam was the first living room war, right? Because you had the TV there with you. So I'm thinking about how they talked about creating drama for the cameras, because the more you bring drama to the camera, the more you bring attention to the issue. And then we have a different kind of activism that comes out of that. So I was wondering, you know, how has this changed in terms of how younger people are using media? And, you know, they talk about sacrificing with your body, which is very different than how we see some people today circulating, you know, online petitions, which is different than, you know, risking going out there and being beat up by police officers and being dragged off to prison, drug off to prison. So I was just wondering if there's any, you know, feeling that anyone has here about the use of media as a way to push forward an agenda as an activist.
Well, I was very impressed that it was a very conscious move.
Yes.
I thought that was like, wow, okay, that really shows that he had a strategy and that he was going to make the news work for him. Okay, and the whole movement. that was just a real aha moment for me.
But, you know, I'm thinking of all the states where they're making laws to make it harder for African Americans to vote today.
Right.
And, you know, I feel like we need a march because, I mean, I'm a kind of marcher kind of
She is a
person,
marcher, yes.
but, you know, you can see this person saying this and this person saying that and whatever, and the statistics are this, but it's a different thing when human beings will stand up and march. And you know, what is her name? Tracy. You know, in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, who I'm just admire so much because I think that she has got her finger on that issue, and she's a woman of brilliance and great integrity, and she keeps at that issue. But I think that maybe it doesn't matter if 50,000 people turn out and say, we've got to save the planet, or something like that. But there's something about being together with other human beings, sweating along with them, having your feet hurt along with them, and marching for something. And so I'm afraid that we let media be too big a thing, and our action be too little a thing.
That sort of goes back to Dr. Carter's original question. I mean, what would you be doing if you lived through World War II? I think the vast majority of us would have been passive witnesses.
Would be what?
Passive witnesses. I think that's what that means, essentially.
Calvin and I would have been marching.
You would have been marching, maybe, but I when I say us, I don't mean the people present. I mean us, as in, yes, the general public. I think so.
Well,
Yeah.
there is supposed to be a Poor People's March on June 20th, led by Reverend Barber, I think, from
Oh, good.
South Carolina,
Uh-huh.
North Carolina,
Yeah.
the People's Movement.
Where's it gonna be?
Washington.
There are a lot of marches.
But he's a big guy, and he's going to the big city.
Well, he's big.
Right.
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of marches right now, and there's some for impeachment, and there are a lot of places, but it feels like this is such a long struggle. It is a long struggle. It's a forever struggle, but that it's a time when this should be right in front of us. And to go back to who owned slaves, I'm a Presbyterian minister. I am not proud to say that between 1720 and 1820, shall we say the majority, I think that's not right, but a good fair minority of the people who held slaves were clergy people. And it was, when you say quite rightly, how could they do that? It was not, the churches had produced a rationale that it was not bad, that in fact it was really good to be helping these poor people in this way. And so, but I'm not proud as a minister to say that we got it slowly, very slowly. Maybe we haven't gotten it yet.
I'd like to piggyback on one point that you made, because I have a similar question here. Considering the current attempts to limit voting rights in view of the 2020 presidential election, what lessons can we learn from issues around disenfranchising Black folks in the film? Because you brought this up just a minute ago.
I did bring it.
And so, this is many decades ago now, and here we are again.
Here we are again.
That's right. Well, we had a little interesting conversation actually with Nora, with his wife, where it was a small conversation, a small group, where we were talking about polling, all these people polling, and she said, nobody even polls us, so they don't even know what we think. So I don't answer the phone either as a senior, because I'm so disgusted with all these people calling me, but she says, but we've never been polled, so people are always surprised when we can get the Black vote turned out to actually make a difference in an election, okay, because no one really even checks in with us.
Well, polls are very interesting. I know some people that do that for a living, and they're very, very meticulous of how they do it and what they do it. And it's interesting, looking back at the last election we had, Hillary, everybody told Hillary, all the professional people, and all the newspapers said, you are going to win, don't say a word, do not open your mouth up. This guy is putting his foot in his mouth, he will never win, you just keep your mouth quiet, and don't do anything, you're gonna win automatically. 99% of all the newspapers said, that's correct. All the poll people said, that's correct. She's ahead by 4, 5, 8, 9, 10 points ahead before the election. Well, there was 2 newspapers that said, no, you're going to lose. All the professional people that she hired and paid for said, you're going to win. And they were all winners. They knew their business. Well, guess what? She lost.
Well, she didn't lose the popular vote.
Right.
That's correct.
But she
Unfortunately,
didn't
she's not our
follow
president.
The law of the land.
But polls are interesting, they do quite a
She didn't follow
job.
the law of the land. I mean, it's the Electoral College that elects the president, and she knew that, and people who worked for her knew that. But they stopped her from going to the states that had the biggest amount of votes to get the Electoral College. Yeah, she didn't go to them, so she lost.
They told her that she didn't have to.
Yeah.
He was gonna talk himself right out of it. And in most cases, he would have. But he is a professional individual, and he knows how to get what people in this country have not talked about, and that's racism. They don't like what our country's doing to the people down in Mexico, the people in Florida, any other place. They don't want to have other people coming into this country, and they want to have their money spent on taxes on themselves and their families. Not only these other black people coming in, and the president hit on that. He knew it. And he just blew it up like a big, big balloon, and they all were saying, we're 100% behind you. And as he said one time, not too recently, when he was running, you know what, I could shoot somebody on a main street in New York and not get blamed for anything.
And that's true,
And that is
Yeah,
true.
that is true.
apparently.
Yeah. So we have a lot of people in this country who are with this president. And he's got a good chance of winning again, unfortunately. But it's not guaranteed.
Well, this might be a good segue to another question here, just thinking about that dynamic between the two major candidates in the last election. And this is a little provocative, but I'll say it. So Martin Luther King can be considered a philanderer. Trump might be considered sexist, considered things he said and done.
And a philanderer.
And a philanderer. Are there differences in what we accept from our leadership in the
Race.
present moment and in retrospect, according to race, age, gender, and other identity markers? Just wondering. Yeah.
I'll just say you have different standards,
Right. Okay.
period. If you look at half of the things that our current presidents have said and did,
Right.
and if you look at, I'll say, previous presidents, they would be on the carpet. They would never get their chance a day. You have a president that tends to be untruthful day in and day out, versus someone else, if they just tell one or two untruths, it's major news. And I think in this country, we have double standards. We treat individuals differently depending on what they have and their worth and their value and how they are looked at. And that's life. And you get used to it. Not saying that it's right.
Shouldn't get used to it.
You don't necessarily have to get used to it, but it doesn't say that it's right. But it happens. And you have to adjust your sail accordingly to deal with that.
Well, one of the big changes, Calvin, I think, is that, like, Jack Kennedy was very active, but at that time, there was an agreement that one's private life, the
Right.
newspapers
Right.
did not publish
Right.
what they knew. And I'm not saying it's that good or bad, but, you know.
Today, you don't control the media.
to-
You know, the media doesn't control the media.
Right.
They get the news as quick as we get the news. When you look up and you see a Twitter, or you see an Instagram, or you see a Facebook post, they just got it like we got it.
We got it before them, actually.
Sometimes it is happening. It is a powerful media, you know, the way that we communicate today in our society. Much different than just waiting for NBC, CBS, and ABC to come on.
Right.
You don't need them anymore.
Right?
You know, your phone popping like that every other minute. Something's coming up. Breaking news.
We democratize media in as much as we possibly can, and so
Yeah. So that's just my take on it.
So in the film, and any of us who know a little bit about civil rights history know a little bit about this, you know, sort of tension between maybe old school civil rights activism and the emerging sense of Black power that's coming from urban centers. It's coming from a younger demographic, and it sort of pushes back against the so-called assimilationist idea about progress. And so we see it happen in the film with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and then we see SNCC on the other end, right? And so I said I wanted to talk about any correlations between more, and I'm using these terms to be purposefully provocative, passive or militant notions of activism in today's fight for justice. I don't know, so what would be our more passive way of, I don't know, we can talk anything about gun violence, we can talk about racial injustice, we can talk about issues around gender and women's reproductive health, but, you know, what are our like binaries, like dichotomies there that we're pushing today that might go in line with this more passive versus militant way of engaging?
Well, I think you actually just nailed it, is that we talk about it.
Right.
We don't do anything about it. We talk about it. And in some cases, if we don't want to rile up our relatives, we don't talk about it, just to keep the peace.
Or-
And that's the
or
same
our
in the churches.
parishioners.
Exactly, our parishioners as well.
I was here, I go to this church, and we had a minister, and they talked a little bit about what's happening in our society. And I remember we came out, and I was talking to a gentleman. I said, "Gee, how'd you like that sermon?" And the gentleman says to me, "He ought to mind his own damn business and not talk about politics." I said, "Oh." Wow, I mean, he didn't pull any punches, you know? But the problem is, the ministers do not talk much about it. They have to walk that very, very thin thing, because money's involved, and they're afraid to say it. They're afraid to say what has to be said.
You know, it's not so much fear, it's the fact that we minister to all people. And so, while we may not agree, we minister to all. And we have to, that's what we do.
You have to respect that,
That's right, yeah,
but you have a whole congregation.
yeah, exactly.
And there's a way to present that, in the sense unbiased, objective. And I think the challenge you face is, how do you challenge a congregation between right and wrong and values and trust and character? And if you always have the conversation in that context, you will hit the right nerve with your whole congregation. Because you as a pastor has delivered the message so that you're challenging the congregation and you haven't taken a side yourself.
That's
You're
right.
just bringing it to the forefront so that
That's
people can serve our Lord in a very nice way and carry and walk humbly with the Lord as to what's right and what is not right and what is it that you as an individual believe in. And I have coffee with gentlemen every day, just about, I'll say when I do, and they go to mass almost every day. But yet, they have a different value system when it comes to politics versus what they receive in the pit, in the church. And I say to them, if that's your belief, and that's what you believe in, then you support that. If you can look yourself in the mirror, and that's your values, and that's your character, and that's what you support, who's to tell you not to do it?
That's right.
You know, and that's the dynamics. And I'll leave it at that. I don't have to go any further, because all of us are going to be judged at the appropriate time. All of us are going to have to answer the questions.
I sign a lot of petitions. I get on a lot of sites for people's rights, etc. And I often feel like it's a passive thing. But one thing that did happen this Christmas is that I think it was either PFLAG or GLAD put out a petition. Did you hear about that?
No, I was just not.
Okay, no, sorry. That Hallmark was gonna pull, did you hear that? Was gonna pull an ad for, that had same-sex couple in it. Because they were getting pressure from, I'll say the right. I signed it, not thinking much. Well, they caved. They caved to all the people that signed this petition, and they put that commercial on. So I feel like I could do more, but I try, you know. I think we're all trying. I mean, we're here, you know, so I don't know.
There's a couple more questions. So this is what I was thinking immediately when we see how they're tracking their actions, and we know how much Martin Luther King was surveilled. So I was just wondering, what can this film teach us about government sanctioned surveillance? I mean, this is I don't hear this conversation as much now. I don't know if, you know, after 9/11, we heard a lot for many, many years about what this means, and I've been shocked to discover how many cameras are everywhere. So I just thought that was a conversation worth having.
Would you state your question some other way? I don't quite get it.
Just, so I'm probably thinking more widely about the greater long civil rights movement, as we call it now, and I'm including Black Power in this. I'm thinking about the infiltration of the Black Panther Party, for example, and the corrective work that scholars have had to do in the last several decades to try to understand better what this organization was doing. But then thinking about people like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, who were always had what's the word? The bugs when you're being bugged. Yeah, when you're bugged. Yeah. So I'm just curious about, what does this tell us about the long history of surveillance and privacy, and what does it mean for someone to be considered a threat? I mean, and now we have cameras everywhere, so you don't have to be doing anything, right? It's just the cameras are there for different purposes.
Well, it's
So
also, I guess it's also become like expected. So
Yeah,
whereas
yeah.
before, I mean,
Right.
doing the bugging they would do to me is outrageous, okay?
Right.
But today, you can't even, you can't help it being easily observed wherever you are. So I think it's just a very different world, and your expectation, I think, is very different today than back at that time.
Yes, or even just as soon as you said that we expect it, I thought about how many of us are talking about something and then we cut on our phone, we press the button on our phones, and it has somehow, our voice has been recorded, and now they know that we're talking about tortilla chips, right? Yeah, and so,
It's the same thing if you have Alexa in your house.
yes, oh, we do.
Oh my gosh, yeah, well, yeah.
That thing records everything.
Yeah,
You might not
yeah.
believe it, but somebody's out there listening to your conversation somewhere
Right,
and deciphering what you're saying.
right.
We were having a conversation in our house with Alexa. And to make a long story short, we're talking, and all of a sudden, this thing answers. You know where that Alexa is now?
Yep.
In the trash. That was the end of that Alexa. You're not a part of this conversation anymore. But it happens.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Scary. And who knows what the large implications are, and if we have fear of it for legitimate reasons.
Many years ago, I had a class reunion, and had a friend of mine, and we were in the same grade school, had same names, close to the same names. And so he says, "Mike, you're working for the government, huh?" I said, "Government? No, I'm not working for the government. Where did you get that idea?" He said, "Back about 6, 7 years ago, a couple of guys came to my house dressed in suits, and they said that you were probably applying for a government job, and they wanted to ask me some questions about you. What did Mike read? What did Mike talk about? What did you guys do, for fun?" And I thought, "Now, where the hell did he get this idea?" And then I thought, I know where he got it. I lived in Maryland, and I used to be a sales rep. I used to travel in that area, and I knew where Camp David was. And I had some friends visiting. I said, "Gee, you want to go by Camp David?" They said, "Sure." Now, there's a little sign in front of Camp David about this big. It doesn't say anything about no trespassing. So we went down the road, and there's a Marine booth down there. The Marine came out, and he says, "Sir, can I help you?" I said, "Yeah, I'm wondering if the president's in." Not a good thing to say, maybe. What do you hear about the president, So I said that. And he said, "I'm sorry, sir, is there business you need to do with the president?" I said, "No, I'm just wondering, I was in the area and wanted to show these people." He said, "Well, you're going to have to leave." I said, "Okay, So as we're turning around, my wife says to me, they're taking pictures of our car. They had cameras there. And so they wanted to find out who this guy was going over there. And that was years and years ago. So, they do seem to watch everything very carefully. And my grandfather came from Russia. He fought with the Russians, My father was in the Navy also, and I was in the military. And my son's in the military, my grandson's in the military. But sometimes, our society is very, very careful what they do.
Just do that one little thing, Mike, and they
Yep.
got you. Triggers questions.
Right.
I'd have questions about you anyways.
So I just have one final question, and it's a two-part question, but I think it'll bring about some conversation. And while I do love and enjoy the film, I think of the way that I teach history as a social history, and trying to get at those stories of people who aren't big, major folks. So obviously the film features many important historical figures. Of course, Martin Luther King, right? Mahalia Jackson, Malcolm X, Lyndon Johnson, Ralph Abernathy.
John Lewis.
Yes, and then we see toward the end, Sammy Davis Jr., we see Harry Belafonte. Of course, we see a lot of other people too in the background, but we notice them. So I'm just wondering, what can you glean about ordinary, everyday, rank and file activists from watching this film, and what ways does it encourage you to go out and know more about that, the invisibility of them? And then the other part to that question is, we see Malcolm X appeal to Coretta Scott King. to give a talk in Malcolm X's place, and we see the women in the film play an important role, but a supportive role. But we also know that women did so much more during the civil rights movement, in any moment in history. One of the most shocking things I discovered in just learning about how to better teach my survey course was that women were almost were majorly responsible for crafting the legislation of the New Deal policies in the 1930s. I mean, who would know, right? I mean, like, and so I'm just curious about that. Who's not there in the film, in terms of both women as important players in the civil rights movement, but also just our ordinary, everyday rank and file. We saw them, right? They had the backpacks, they're sleeping on the ground. But I just wanted to maybe have a little bit of conversation about that.
Well, I'm just gonna relate to the movie Hidden Figures.
Yes.
And that took place at about the same time.
Right.
And not activists in that sense, but they were activists in their own work environment.
Well, Angela Davis was not in that film, and she was a great woman activist, and my younger sister, my little sister, who's, tall, my younger sister was a communist at that time, as was Angela Davis, but she was a real spokesperson for African American rights, and my sister was her minder, because my sister was white, and they figured that if Angela were picked up and put in jail somewhere, my sister would not be picked up, and she could get the message to whoever needed to be gotten to. And I think Angela's still active and powerful. So
Yes.
I relate back to your first question. Did you see yourself in the movie?
Right.
And I think Viola Liuzzo, I think that was her name, the white woman who was murdered 5 months after Dr. King spoke in Montgomery, and all she was doing was giving people rides. All she was doing was giving people rides, just a regular, average person living out her belief. She wasn't a big person. She wasn't. We don't remember her name.
Right.
But thank heavens, Ava
Ava
remembered her.
Right. Any other thoughts about the film?
I was exhausted at the end. I was kind of like sobbing through most of it. I don't know.
I was glad we couldn't see it better.
Yeah.
Because it was going through a meat grinder. It was so painful. It made me feel so grief filled and also guilty.
The nonviolence issue. Think of Mahatma Gandhi. How many years ago that was, and what that whole regime went through, and how he marched up, and they had all the women with fixing. They were getting whacked in the head, and they had all the women fixing them up and sending them back in. And they just did not tolerate any violence at all. And I mean, look at how that movement, the support that movement had.
But I was surprised to go and whacked one of the policemen, and I thought,
Oprah Winfrey's character.
huh?
Oprah Winfrey's character.
And she would do that in life too, I'm sure. But it felt like I thought there was going to have to be a moment when Martin spoke to her and said, "I'm so sorry that you were in the situation you were, but we're nonviolent." But it wasn't brought up at all.
Right.
Everybody else was nonviolent except that woman, and she really slugged him.
With her purse.
I think
She whacked him with her purse.
I like that
I
kind
think
of
she was
woman.
actually strategic about that.
I'm sorry.
She was strategic about that because they would have killed that guy had she not intervened.
Right.
So
Okay.
Shifting the attention.
yeah, I think she shifted the attention to herself because she was, a black she didn't look like she was in her 20s, so she was a more mature woman.
Yeah.
So there might have been some hesitation to murder her in front of everybody, as opposed to this young black man who you could easily paint as being aggressive.
Yeah.
But I think she may have, that character may have been strategic to divert the attention from
It's out there, it's over there.
And it was very strategic, I think. I mean, we saw some of it, and it was showing how they would have to react if they were being attacked, and
Right.
just sort of practicing
Right.
for that possibility.
Well, and that was the only instance in the movie anyway in which one of the African Americans broke ranks with the nonviolence.
But I appreciated that part of the film where they're showing us how strategic they were, because, I mean, I was a full-grown woman before I realized that Rosa Parks was an activist who had been trained in many different states on how to go about doing this.
Didn't just happen. to sit
Yeah.
there.
What they didn't show, which was very dramatic on television, they showed that when they had the police dogs out there and the fire hoses. And they came through and they were all over the place knocking them down. The dogs were biting the people there. And it was just crazy. And I thought, oh my God.
Somehow we have to get out before this next election and make sure that everybody can vote, which means that we need to get into the poorer neighborhoods to make sure.
Yes, well, there are a lot of people who can vote, that didn't vote
That didn't vote.
this last time. I mean, it amazes me.
Half the population
It just
didn't
amazes
vote.
me. Yeah.
Half the population didn't
Half
vote.
the population that could have voted didn't vote.
But we wanna make sure that if a person could vote, that they're registered.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining us,
Thank you
and
for
thank you to
coming.
Siobhan for facilitating. This was a really fantastic discussion. This will be posted on the library social media for everyone to enjoy. So thank you so much for participating and for being here today. So.